The train crawled across the Montana plains like a wary animal searching for water, its whistle cutting through the vast silence of the territory. Inside the third passenger car, Eleanor Hartwell sat with her hands folded in her lap, her fingers trembling despite her efforts to appear calm. She wore her best dress, a faded blue cotton thing that had seen better days, and her hair was pinned back as neatly as her shaking hands had managed that morning. The reflection in the window showed her what she already knew, what she had known all her life. Plain features. A face too angular, a nose too prominent, eyes set a bit too far apart. Her mother had once said she had character in her face, but Eleanor knew what that meant. It was the kind thing people said when they couldn't say you were pretty. 3 months ago, she had answered an advertisement in the Boston newspaper. A rancher in Montana seeking a wife. He promised a good home, honest work, and respect. He hadn't asked for a photograph, which Eleanor had found both suspicious and merciful. She had written him 3 letters, each one more honest than most mail, order arrangements allowed. She told him she could read and write, that she could cook and sew, that she had helped her father keep the books for his small mercantile before he died. She told him she wasn't young anymore at 28, and that she had no illusions about romance. She was practical, she wrote, and she hoped he was too. His responses had been brief but kind. His name was James Mackenzie. He ran a cattle ranch with his younger brother. He needed help with the house and the accounts. He said he would meet her at the station in Copper Falls. The train shuddered to a stop, steam hissing into the cold November air. Eleanor gathered her single carpetbag and stepped onto the platform, her legs unsteady after 2 days of travel. The town was smaller than she had imagined. Just a main street with wooden buildings facing each other like tired soldiers. A few people milled about, but her eyes went immediately to the man standing near the station house. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a worn leather coat and a hat that shadowed his face. Another man stood beside him, younger and slighter, with a cruel twist to his mouth that Eleanor recognized immediately. She had seen that expression before, on the faces of boys who had mocked her in school, on men who had looked through her as if she were invisible. James Mackenzie stepped forward, removing his hat. His face was weathered and lined, probably in his middle 30s, with gray already threading through his dark hair. His eyes were a startling blue, and when they met hers, there was something gentle in them, something searching. He opened his mouth to speak, but his brother cut him off. "Jesus Christ, James," the younger man said, his voice carrying across the platform. Several people turned to look. "This is what you sent for. I've seen better-looking horses." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Her bag slipped from her nerveless fingers and hit the wooden platform with a dull thud. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, crystallizing around that single cruel sentence. She had prepared herself for disappointment, for a man who might be unkind or difficult, but she hadn't prepared for this. Not for public humiliation before she had even spoken a word. James Mackenzie's jaw tightened. He looked at his brother with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. Then he bent to pick up her bag. When he straightened, he took a step closer to her, close enough that she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow. The way his hands, rough with work, held her bag carefully as if it were something precious. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and his voice was low and steady, meant only for her. "I apologize for my brother's words. They don't reflect my thoughts." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes. "You're beautiful to me." Eleanor stared at him, certain she had misheard. No one had ever said those words to her. No one had ever looked at her the way he was looking at her now, as if she were something worth seeing, worth knowing. Her throat tightened, and she blinked rapidly against the sudden sting of tears. "I don't need pretty lies," she managed to whisper. "I don't tell lies," James said simply. "Shall we go home?" The ride to the ranch took an hour, the wagon bouncing over rutted roads while the younger brother, who James had tersely introduced as Clayton, rode ahead on horseback. The silence was heavy, but Eleanor found she didn't mind it. She was still reeling from those words, from the way James had said them, as if they were simply fact. She studied him from the corner of her eye. This man who would be her husband, trying to understand what kind of person he was beneath the weathered exterior. The ranch appeared as they crested a low hill. It wasn't grand, but it was substantial. A 2-story house with a wide porch, a large barn, corals spreading out like fingers, and in the distance, cattle dotting the brown grassland. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Eleanor felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. It looked like a home. It looked like a place where she might belong. James helped her down from the wagon, his hands steady on her waist. "It's not much," he said, "but it's sound. The roof doesn't leak, and the stove draws well. It's more than I hoped for," Eleanor said honestly. That night, after a silent supper where Clayton had glared at his food and ignored her completely, James showed Eleanor to a small bedroom on the second floor. "I thought you might want some time," he said. "To be sure. We can go to the preacher in town when you're ready, or if you decide this isn't what you want, I'll give you money for a ticket back east." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. "You'd let me leave?" "I won't keep anyone who doesn't want to be here," James said. "I'm looking for a partner, Miss Hartwell, not a prisoner." She nodded slowly, something in her chest loosening. "I'd like to stay," she said. "If you'll have me." A smile touched the corners of his mouth, the first she had seen from him. "Then we'll go to town on Saturday." The days before the wedding passed in a blur of learning. The house was clean but sparse, a bachelor's home with little thought given to comfort or beauty. Eleanor threw herself into the work, scrubbing floors, mending curtains, organizing the kitchen. She cooked meals from the supplies in the pantry, simple fare but well prepared. James ate with quiet appreciation, always thanking her, always meeting her eyes across the table. Clayton ate in sullen silence, but Eleanor noticed he always cleaned his plate. She found the ranch accounts in a box in James's study, a cluttered room that smelled of leather and tobacco. The books were a mess, entries missing, arithmetic wrong, money unaccounted for. Eleanor spent 2 evenings going through everything, creating a new ledger with neat columns and careful calculations. When she showed James what she had found, he whistled low. "You're saying we have $300 more than I thought." "You do if the men who bought those steers in August actually paid what they promised," Eleanor said. "But there's no record of receiving payment." James's face darkened. "I'll look into it." He studied the ledger, then looked at her with something like wonder. "You did all this in 2 days. Numbers make sense," Eleanor said simply. "They don't lie or judge. They just are what they are." "I reckon that's true," James said softly. He reached across the desk and touched her hand, just briefly, just his fingertips against her knuckles. "Thank you." Saturday came cold and bright. Eleanor wore the same blue dress, having nothing better, but James didn't seem to notice or care. They rode to town in the wagon, side by side, their breaths misting in the morning air. Clayton had refused to come, but Eleanor was grateful for his absence. She didn't want his sneer to taint whatever this fragile thing was that she and James were building together. The preacher was a kind old man with gentle eyes, who asked them the necessary questions and seemed satisfied with their answers. Eleanor felt herself trembling as she repeated the vows, promising to love and honor a man she had known for less than a week. But when James slipped a simple gold band on her finger, a ring that had belonged to his mother, he looked at her with such steadiness, such quiet certainty, that her trembling stopped. "I'll do right by you," he said, as if it were a vow beyond the ones they had already spoken. "I promise you that." "I believe you," Eleanor whispered, and realized she meant it. Their marriage was gentle and careful. 2 people learning each other in the quiet moments between the work that filled their days. James rose before dawn to tend the cattle, and Eleanor rose with him. Making coffee that steamed in the cold kitchen, frying eggs and potatoes while he pulled on his boots. They ate together as the sun painted the eastern sky pink and gold, talking about small things. The weather, the cattle, the garden Eleanor wanted to plant in the spring. James listened when she spoke, really listened, asking questions and remembering her answers. He told her about the ranch, about his parents who had homesteaded this land 30 years ago, about his dreams of building the herd, of creating something that would last. Eleanor learned that James was a man of few words but many kindnesses. He brought her things without fanfare: a bolt of cloth from town for new curtains, a book of poetry he had seen in the mercantile, a chair for the kitchen that didn't wobble. He never made a show of these gifts, just left them where she would find them, as if they had always been there. And at night, in the darkness of their shared room, he held her carefully, as if she were something that might break, and told her in whispers all the ways she amazed him. Her quick mind, her capable hands, the way she had transformed his house into a home. But Clayton remained a shadow over their happiness. He watched Eleanor with undisguised contempt, made cutting remarks just loud enough for her to hear, and contradicted her whenever she spoke. When she suggested they could save money by buying supplies in bulk from the next town over, he laughed harshly. When she mentioned that one of the horses seemed to be favoring its left foreleg, he told James she didn't know what she was talking about. The horse went lame 2 days later, and Clayton blamed Eleanor for not speaking up sooner. James tried to keep peace between them, but Eleanor could see the strain it caused him. Clayton was his brother, the only family he had left, and there was a complicated history between them that Eleanor didn't fully understand. She heard them arguing sometimes, their voices carrying from the barn, James's low and controlled, Clayton's rising with anger and something that sounded almost like pain. One afternoon in late December, Eleanor was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard horses approaching. 3 men rode into the yard, rough-looking characters with hard eyes and guns on their hips. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. She started toward the house, but one of the men called out to her, "You the new Mrs. Mackenzie?" Eleanor stopped, her hand on the porch rail. "I am." "Where's your husband?" "He's out checking the herd. He'll be back by sundown." The man who had spoken dismounted, and Eleanor noticed how his hand rested casually on his gun. "That's a shame. We had business with him. Maybe you know about it. We sold him 60 head of cattle back in August. Prime beef. He still owes us $200. Eleanor's mind raced. She had found that transaction in the accounts, or rather, she had found the record of the purchase, but no corresponding payment. "I believe there's some confusion," she said carefully. "The accounts show that payment was made in full, in cash, on August 15th. Do they now?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's interesting, because we never saw a penny of that money. Then someone's lying," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I don't believe it's my husband." The man's smile faded. He took a step toward the porch, and Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. But then another horse thundered into the yard, and Clayton appeared, his face flushed with anger or perhaps too much whiskey. "What's going on here?" he demanded. The 3 men turned to him, and something passed between them, some look that Eleanor couldn't interpret, but made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Just discussing a business matter with the lady," the spokesman said. "Seems there's some question about money owed." Clayton's face went pale, then red. "Get off our land," he said, his voice shaking. "Now, Ladley," the man said. He swung back into his saddle. "But tell your brother we'll be back. And next time, we expect to be paid what we're owed." He looked at Eleanor, and his eyes were cold. "I'll of it." They rode out, and Eleanor stood frozen on the porch, her mind working through what she had just witnessed. Clayton started to walk toward the barn, but she called out to him. "Clayton, what was that about?" He turned on her, his face twisted with fury. "None of your business. You think because you spread your legs for my brother, you have a right to know everything about this place." Eleanor felt as if she had been slapped. Before she could respond, another voice cut through the cold air. "That's enough." James stood at the corner of the house, and his face was terrible to see. Eleanor had never seen him angry before, but she saw it now, a cold fury that made Clayton take a step back. James walked past Eleanor without looking at her, advancing on his brother until they stood face to face. "Apologize to my wife," James said quietly. "I won't," Clayton said, but his voice wavered. Then get off my land. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Clayton's face cycled through shock, rage, and something that might have been fear. You choose her over me? Over your own blood. You made the choice when you disrespected her in my home, James said. I've made excuses for you, Clayton. I've covered for you, lied for you, cleaned up your messes. But I won't let you hurt her. Eleanor saw it then, the pieces falling into place. The missing money, the angry men, Clayton's drinking and his resentment. She moved down from the porch, her hand finding James's arm. James, those men. They said you owed them money. James's jaw worked, but he didn't look away from his brother. We don't owe them anything. The debt was paid in full. I handed Clayton the money to deliver it, because I was away checking on a sick heifer. He finally looked at his brother, and Eleanor heard the break in his voice. Where did the money go, Clay? Clayton said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. He had taken the money, spent it on liquor or cards or whatever other vices pulled at him, and left his brother to face the consequences. Eleanor felt a surge of anger, but also, unexpectedly, a wave of pity. She looked at Clayton and saw not a man but a boy, lost and bitter and drowning in his own failures. I'll pay them back, Clayton said finally, his voice thick. I'll find a way. With what? James asked tiredly. You have nothing, Clay. You've gambled away every dollar I've given you. Eleanor squeezed James's arm. How much do we have in the account? James looked at her. About 400, after selling that last string of horses. But that's for winter supplies, for feed if the snow gets bad. We can't. We can? Eleanor said firmly. We'll pay them what's owed. We'll be careful with the rest. We'll make it work. Eleanor, that's your money too now. You shouldn't have to. We're partners, Eleanor said, using the word he had used that first night. Partners share the burdens. That evening, after Clayton had ridden off to wherever he went, when he couldn't face his brother's eyes, Eleanor and James sat together by the fire. James held her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I'm sorry, he said. I brought you into this mess. Those men might come back. It might get dangerous. I'm not afraid, Eleanor said, and was surprised to find it was true. I've faced worse than dangerous men. James looked at her questioningly, and Eleanor found herself telling him things she had never told anyone. About her father's death and the debts he had left behind. About the cousins who had taken her in and made her feel like a burden, a mouth to feed that contributed nothing. About the small cruelties of a world that judged women by their faces and found her wanting. About the loneliness of being invisible, of being passed over again and again, until she had almost convinced herself that she deserved it. I answered your advertisement because I had nowhere else to go, Eleanor said. I thought I would come here and keep your house and cook your meals, and you would tolerate me because it was convenient. I never expected. Her voice caught. I never expected you to see me. James pulled her closer, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. How could I not see you, Eleanor? You're the strongest person I know. You're smart and brave, and you make everything better just by being here. When I saw you on that platform, do you know what I thought? Eleanor shook her head. I thought, there's a woman who's been hurt by the world and kept going anyway. I thought, there's a woman with real beauty, the kind that matters, the kind that lasts. He touched her face, his rough fingers gentle on her cheek. I meant what I said that first day. You're beautiful to me. The most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Eleanor kissed him then, pouring into it all the words she didn't know how to say. All the gratitude and wonder and growing love that filled her chest until she could hardly breathe. When they finally pulled apart, they sat together in the firelight, and Eleanor felt something she had never felt before. She felt home. The winter was hard, but they survived it together. Eleanor stretched every dollar, made meals from little, mended clothes until they couldn't be mended anymore. James worked himself nearly to exhaustion, but every evening he came home to her, and they sat together and planned for spring. They would plant a bigger garden. They would rebuild the South Coral. They would hire a hand to help with the cattle, because James couldn't do everything alone anymore. Clayton returned in February, gaunt and sober, with a look in his eyes that Eleanor had never seen before. Something had broken in him, or maybe something had finally healed. He stood on the porch, hat in his hands, and asked if he could speak to both of them. They sat in the kitchen, the three of them, while Clayton told them he had been working on a ranch 2 territories over. He had sent most of his wages to the men. They owed money too. It wasn't enough yet, but it was a start. He said he had stopped drinking. He said he was trying to be better. "I know I have no right to ask," Clayton said, looking at Eleanor directly for the first time since that day on the train platform. "But I need to apologize to you, ma'am. What I said when you arrived, and after, the way I treated you. There's no excuse for it. You've been nothing but good to my brother, good to this ranch. You've been better to me than I deserved, and I'm ashamed of how I repaid that kindness." Eleanor saw the sincerity in his eyes, the hard-won humility that had cost him something real. She thought about forgiveness, about how holding on to anger was like holding on to hot coals, burning yourself to punish someone else. "Thank you for saying that," she said quietly. "And yes, I forgive you." Clayton's eyes widened, as if he hadn't expected that grace. James reached across the table and gripped his brother's shoulder, and something passed between them, some wordless understanding that Eleanor was privileged to witness. Spring came with a rush of green across the plains. Wildflowers painting the grassland in colors Eleanor had only dreamed about during the long Boston winters. She planted her garden with hands that were no longer soft, that had learned the feel of soil and hard work. She stood on the porch in the evenings and watched James and Clayton work the cattle. Brothers again, rebuilding what had been broken between them. And in the quiet moments, in the space between dawn and day, James held her and told her he loved her. Not because she was beautiful, though he always said she was. Not because she was useful, though she was that too. But because she was Eleanor. Because she had come to this wild place and made it bloom. Because she had looked at his broken brother and offered forgiveness. Because she had taken his simple words on a train platform and trusted them enough to build a life. One morning in May, Eleanor stood in the doorway of their home and looked out over the land that had become hers. The ranch wasn't grand, but it was sound. The roof didn't leak, and the stove drew well. More than that, it was filled with laughter now, with planning and hope and the daily miracle of being known. She thought about the woman she had been, the one who had climbed onto that train certain she was settling for whatever scraps of happiness life might throw her way. She barely recognized that woman now. James came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Eleanor leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beating of his heart against her back. "I'm thinking about coming home," she said. "How sometimes you have to travel 1,000 miles to find the place you were always meant to be. Or the person," James said softly. Eleanor turned in his arms, looked up at the face that had become dearer to her than any face in the world, weathered and kind and real. "Yes," she said. "Or the person." She kissed him there in the doorway, while the Montana sun rose golden over the plains, while the cattle lowed in the distance and the spring wind carried the scent of wild sage and new grass. She kissed him and thought about beauty, about how the world was so wrong about what it meant. Real beauty wasn't in a perfect face or a graceful figure. Real beauty was in the choice to see someone truly, to look past the surface and recognize the soul beneath. Real beauty was in the courage to build something together, to forgive and be forgiven, to plant gardens in hard ground and trust they would bloom. Eleanor Mackenzie stood in the doorway of her home, her husband's arms around her, and knew herself to be rich beyond measure. Not because someone had finally called her beautiful, though those words had changed her life, but because she had learned to see her own beauty reflected in the eyes of someone who loved her, truly loved her for exactly who she was. And that, she thought, was worth every hard mile, every lonely year, every moment of doubt that had led her here. The ranch wasn't much, just a house and some land and the promise of tomorrow. But it was hers, and it was enough. It was everything.